Hello and welcome to today's special webinar event on 2022 data protection trends for the public sector. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's great content, there are a few things that you should know about this webinar. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the question box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll have a dedicated Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. And I should say, we've got a couple of great speakers today who are quick on their feet, and we'll welcome your questions all throughout. Second, in the handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources. There's a link to the 2022 Data Protection Trends Report that this session is based on, so be sure to check that out. And there are also links to the Actual Tech Media Guerrilla Guide Book Club and the ATM Event Center, where you can find out about more events like this one, as well as our EcoCasts and Megacasts. So I encourage you to access those resources now and share them with your friends and colleagues. Third, at the end of this webinar, we will be awarding a $300 Amazon gift card to one lucky attendee on the live event. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of that prize drawing can be found in the handout section. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find them there. Finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. At the end of the event, we'll look at all the questions, pick out the very best one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's content. So it's my pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. We have Jason Buffington, who's Vice President of Solution Strategy at Veeam, and we have Jeff Reichert, who's Vice President of Public Sector and Compliance Strategy. I'm delighted to have you both here. And Jason, I'll just turn things over to you to get us started.
Oh, thanks for having us. Yes, my name is Jason Buffington. I have been with Veeam for 4 years. I've been in the data protection space for 32 years. It's the only thing I've done since getting out of school. Jeff and I work for the Office of CTO at Veeam.
Yes, great having everyone here today. My name is Jeff Reichert. I am also on the same product strategy team in the Office of the CTO at Veeam that Jason's in. But my focus is a little bit different. I tend to work more with our public sector customers, both federal and state and local, and with all of our customers that are regulated that have compliance burdens. So I focus a lot on that in my role. So let's go ahead and jump in. We're going to do something a little bit different in today's talk, and the title might have clued you in about that. We're going to focus in the talk today on some specific data points that we got from a big survey. And why this is going to be interesting for you, I think, is that typically when I speak with my customers that are public sector customers, I talk with them about what their priorities going to 2022 are. There's a number of well-known studies out there. And if we boil it down, we can get pretty general about what those priorities are. And I think this is probably going to resonate with everyone that's on the call today. Obviously, the ongoing COVID response is not going anywhere, both from the standpoint of remote citizen services, remote work, remote schooling, but also the ongoing economic impacts and other disruptions. Customers I talk to also talk about the ongoing IT modernization efforts. If you look just as one example at the National Association of State CIOs at their 2022 top 10 priorities, 5 out of 10 of those relate to IT modernization in one facet or another. So this was accelerated by COVID, and it is accelerating and continuing to move on now as well. It's remained at top of mind for state CIOs and local and educational leadership. Of course, it's not like there's magically more resources to do that with. So we also have to focus on resource management, on cost control, and we have to do all of that in an environment with a significantly greater threat surface significantly greater threat landscape than we've had in the past around cybersecurity, ransomware, things like that. Two, to cite the National Association of State CIOs top 10 priorities again, two of those priorities were around cybersecurity. So again, not at all a surprise. What we're going to do today, though, is go from general, so the top priorities here, to really specifically looking at what our customers in federal government, in state and local government, and in education think about data protection, data management, about the threats, challenges, and opportunities that they see coming in the future. And that's why Jason's on the call, because that is completely Jason's area of expertise. And I'll let Jason introduce the study that we're going to be talking about today.
All right, thanks, Jeff. So the project that we're going to talk about today, the research is called the Data Protection Trends Report for 2022. And I believe we actually have a link to the full report afterwards. This is the largest independent research project published in the data protection space that we're aware of. Typically a normal analyst firm, and I was an analyst before I joined Veeam. I was an analyst for 7 years covering the data protection market. I've been with Veeam for the last 4. Typically, an industry project is 300, 400, 500 can be very powerful. This project was 3,400 responses, 3,400 IT leaders, all unbiased. These are not Veeam customers. Actually, statistically speaking, some portion of them are from a market share perspective, but 3,400 IT leaders focused on data protection and IT strategy. Now, this first data point is actually even, you think that's big. This is even bigger. And we're going to go into, of those 3,400, what do public sector organizations think in just a few minutes. But this data actually looks at the global number. And in this case, we're looking at 8 for that is because when you look at this data, if you look, let's use the left block just to kind of keep track of things. If you look at the left cluster on that side, we asked in 2020, what percentage of your servers were physical on the left, virtual in the middle, or cloud hosted using either an MSP or a hyperscale IaaS provider on the right-hand side? And you see that in 2020, it was about 38 to 30 to 32. By the way, those numbers are pre-COVID. And you can see that everything after that is post-COVID. So we asked in 2020, not only are you doing in 20, but what do you think it's going to be 2 years later? Right? Another year comes around in 2021. We asked I guess that's the light bluish green, if you were, 29%. And then also what they thought it was going to be in 2023. That's in gray. And then this year for the 2022 report, that's the darkest green in the middle of each chunk, and also what they think it's going to be in 2024. And I will tell you that from a data analytics perspective, the curve on these 3 data sets is nearly perfect. Right? You can absolutely see that, pre-COVID, we had a higher dependency on infrastructure as most organizations pivoted towards a remote workforce. Yes, it'd be logical that there was an overcorrection towards cloud hosted infrastructure. That said, the other part of the story that I think is really interesting is this data does prove the data center is not going anywhere. Right? There are absolutely a lot of reasons why you should still be running production physical and virtualized servers within on-premise infrastructure. That said, as organizations embrace a cloud-first strategy, most IT leaders are looking at if a workload can be in a cloud, let's put it in a cloud. And the net result is that's going to dilute the amount of physical and virtual still left. Now, this is 8,000 data points over 3 years, organizations all over 1,000 employees, so all enterprise class organizations. Let's take a closer look on that. And for the 2022 data, let's look at what public sector actually fared in this. And in this case, the data is not that far off, a little less physical, a little bit more virtual, right? But other than that, public sector really is tracking with the private sector as far as that embracing of multi and hybrid as a landscape moving forward. Jeff, I'm really excited about what that means for organizations of all sizes.
Well, it fits exactly with what we talked about from things like the National Association of State CIOs, with 5 out of 10 of their top priorities being IT modernization, moving to cloud, moving to remote citizen services, to remote work, to remote education. You can see this. It also corresponds to two other things that, Jason, I know we hear from our public sector customers all the time. One of them, to echo what you just said, that the physical data center is not going anywhere. I have plenty of public sector customers who are delighted with the workloads that they have in the cloud, but
Sure.
data gravity or security or whatever indicate that there are some things that are going to stay on-prem. Maybe they're public safety records. Maybe they're body cam images that are just so huge that they want to keep them on-prem in storage solutions that they manage for right now and figure out a way to get them to the cloud later if they ever go. And those are real conversations we have with people. Another thing that I
Yeah, and
really
I
like,
think part of,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, that's all right. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, certainly there are some cases where media size and media value comes in the conversation as far as what goes up into cloud versus not. Also, the reality that we're seeing is that for a lot of organizations, they are standing up new servers that are cloud hosted, including both IaaS and SaaS, at a far faster rate than they are decommissioning the present mode platforms they're currently using. So if it's working, don't break it. And yet, as new workloads spin up, they're cloud first when capable. That does kind of lean into, though, perhaps the first piece of best practice guidance that we should be thinking about is as workloads do move from physical or virtual to cloud and back again. We see a lot of organizations that are repatriating workloads from cloud back down. You need to make sure that you're thinking about a data protection strategy that is holistic across physical, virtual, and multi-cloud in a consistent way. Maybe we can start making a list of things that we should be taking away from the session. That's probably the first one.
Yep. Very good. So what we'd like to do, what Jason and I wanted to do when we set this up is let's set the stage and go from general to specific. And the most general place we can look is, where is stuff actually running? Is it running on-prem? Is it running in the cloud? Is it a combination of both? Now let's look at how well organizations are doing actually protecting that data. And Jason, let's look at that at a global level from the large 3,400 people worldwide report. Talk us through what we're looking at on this graph.
Yeah, so for a lot of years, Veeam has always asked customers a question, especially the IT leaders, the CXOs, the VPs of IT, et cetera. What's your perception on, are you getting what you need from IT when it comes to availability and or protection? And those are different questions, by the way. So just take a look at the top one, for example. Imagine going into, and this is maybe homework for all the folks on the call today. Imagine going to some of the business leaders or the functional leaders within your organization and just asking, look, IT stuff breaks. It does. Every once in a while, stuff is going to happen, right? When IT goes down, how long can the core processes continue? How long can we serve taxpayers? How long can we serve students? How long can troops be in theater? Whatever the scenario is in the public sector, how long can we do our mission while until IT can get back up again? And then go next door to the IT team and say, look, stuff breaks. It's going to happen. We know that, right? How long does it really take to get back up and running again? Right? And there's a gap there. And in fact, if you look on the top of that, 47% strongly agree, 43% agree. So collectively 90%, 9 out of 10 organizations believe there is a gap between how quickly they need IT to be back online and versus how quickly IT can actually come back online. The bottom question's even simpler. The ask the business folks, hey, how much data could we afford to lose if we had to back up a little bit, if we had to revert to a previous point in time or recover? And then just go next door, ask the IT folks, how often do we back up? Right? And again, what you're going to get is 89% are going to say we would lose more data than we can tolerate. So I think you've got both an availability gap on the top and a protection gap, and both of them are about 9 out of 10 orgs. That's typically a really interesting way to start a conversation with your operational CTOs and CXOs across the company or the organization.
Yep, absolutely. You'll notice, in fact, and this is interesting to me, by the way, for those of you who haven't seen these reality gap studies from Veeam in the past, and as Jason mentioned, we do them year after year, these numbers don't budge a lot, right? It's typically a fairly high percentage of folks who, when they dig in, realize we're going to be down for longer than the mission wants us to be down, and we're going to lose more data than the mission thinks we can afford to lose. if something goes wrong. It's the extreme outliers who don't think that they have a problem. And of course, it's debatable whether they are accurate about that or whether they just have things completely nailed down. Let's hope it's the latter, but
Sure.
it's up in the air. One of the cool things about the size of this survey, as Jason mentioned before, is that it does let us dig in and look in a statistically relevant way at subsets of the data, at slices of the data. So let's take this exact same reality gap and let's compare it with public sector. And Jason, I think it's pretty clear what we're looking at here.
Yeah, again, you don't need 3,400 responses in order to get good data, right? The reason we do that is because Veeam understands that that public sector looks different than private sector. In fact, in private sector, financial services looks different than healthcare, looks different than manufacturing, looks different than retail. Right. And so it's important that as we go out and meet with our customers and our partners and the opportunities for folks looking for better data protection, we need to understand what is it that matters in each of these truly valuable markets. And so what you're looking at here is of the 3,400 responses, 351, so about 12%. Of the responses, 11%, came from public sector institutions, including federal organizations, state and local governments, or education. And that can be local education as well as higher ed. And again, now when you break that 351 and you cut it times three different markets, those ends start to get a little bit small. But again, I love the fact that pretty much everyone's seeing the same thing. You're right, Jeff, that the numbers don't budge much year over year. But what I will tell you is they go up a little every year, kind of like property taxes, maybe. Every year they go just a little bit higher and a little bit higher. Sorry, state and local joke. Sorry, but consistently we are seeing just a high dependency on data, no matter where you are in the org.
Yep, absolutely. Now, we need to back up a second because we are going to take questions in line. I want to make sure this is interactive. And we had a question about the hybrid infrastructure slide that we did just a couple of slides ago. So I'm going to back up here and work through this real quickly. First question is from Laura. Lots of companies are going to work as hybrid from now on. What do you think the hybrid infrastructure is going to look like 5 years from now? And Jason, you do this research. So if you look in your crystal ball, what would you guess we're going to be seeing in 5 years?
If you look at the trend lines over a 4-year window from 2021 to 2024, so that is everything except the lime greens on the left, you do see three pretty clean sentiments. You see that physical continues to dilute year over year. So especially as organizations look at expensive storage arrays on-prem, as those come out of maintenance and warranty, you should expect to see some of those are going to decommission. It's going to be single-digit decrements year over year, but you should expect to see that continue to dilute a little bit. You can look at that 4-year trend line in the middle on virtualization. For most organizations, whatever is virtualized is going to stay virtualized. Right now, there may be a net sum gain where some physical goes to Vert and Vert goes to cloud. But what you're looking at 23, 25, 24, 24, right, within a point of each other on a 4-year curve, I still expect that the gold standard of what runs on premises will be virtualized infrastructure. So little by little, you'll decommission the physical boxes. The virtual plant will stay relatively flat. And then you're going to see that influx on that right-hand side. Some of the data that we don't have in this particular survey that's worth pointing out, when you look at secondary infrastructure, the math looks a little bit different. And so when we look at things like a federal agency that has infrastructure in both the East Coast and the West Coast, and I call that a bow tie, right? The left protects the right protects the left kind of thing. In those kinds of scenarios, what we see is that data center investment stays flat. About 30% of organizations using that dual data center mirrored approach. And then all of the growth, if you're going to do things like business continuity, that's all cloud powered. We don't have more time to cover for that one today, but great question. But yeah, single digit continued decline on physical. It never goes to zero. There will always be a reason for physical boxes. Vert stays flat, and cloud continues to take the bloom off of that.
Perfect. We have a question. I'm going to skip forward now. We have a lot of good questions, some that we will not be able to, around security specifically. I'll just apologize to folks who are asking really specific ransomware recovery questions. We're going to touch on ransomware recovery and downtime and causes of outages a bit later in the talk, but we do have other resources that we can share with you on that get into a lot of detail. There was a good question about the reality gap, though.
Okay.
And this question comes from Jeff. Are there statistics on what the actual reality gap, that is, the recovery timelines, are by sector? I would be interested in what other organizations think they can do and need they can do. And the good news, Jeff, we actually do have a slide that nets out acceptable downtime for public sector and education a little bit later on. And Jason, you've got a ton of that data by at least a couple of other verticals, right?
We do. The fun part about this particular question is what we're really measuring is the difference in expectations between the functional leaders and the IT infrastructure, right? But we absolutely do have questions on what is acceptable downtime, what is acceptable data loss. We will get a chance to show you part of that. Again, you should definitely go to and download the full report. It's VEE.am/DPR22. And that full report has the global data set in it as well, because what we find is that as organization size changes, as well as the vertical and mission, that can vary quite dramatically. Also, we often find that you'll have some applications that are more mission critical than others, but you'd be surprised how flat those two expectations are. But take a look at the full report. We will get a chance to cover that as well. You're right. It does vary by industry. And yes, you should check it out for yours.
Yep. Gilbert makes an excellent point that obviously there are trade-offs between how quickly we can recover and how frequently we protect data and how much money we have to spend, which is always the trade-off in disaster recovery and business continuity questions. It has been. I've been doing this for over 20 years too, and Gilbert, that's been a concern forever. So you're 100% right about that.
If budget was not a problem, everyone would want millisecond level. Everyone would do synchronous data protection on everything. Everyone would have a secondary site for all infrastructure. Budget is a lovely problem, right? It's a forcing function between you can have whatever you want as long as you pay for it. And so typically what you do is start working the math backwards. What does an hour downtime cost? What does an hour, if you lose an hour of data, right? Statistically speaking, you'll spend about 80 to 85% of the time recreating whatever was done in an hour, if it is recreatable at all. And so the trick is actually to convert downtime and data loss into dollars of manpower or other kinds of quantifiable impact. Once you have cost of problem, then you can start talking about typically multiply cost of problem times 5, and that's your budget. And the reason I say that is because most CFOs want an ROI or TCO return on about a 20% value. So if you know cost of problem, multiply that times 5, that's your budget. And then start working from there. And not everything needs millisecond data loss.
Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so let's dive in. This is where we are. If we take this in a logical way, folks, we've seen there's a problem, and public sector and education actually come very close. I mean, it's 90% roughly for all sectors, and it's darn close to 90% for state and local, for education, and for federal government. Now, we also ask the question, okay, this is where we're coming from. We know where the infrastructure is. We perceive that there's a gap between what we're doing now and what we'd like to do. If we were going to change things, why would we change? What is it that we would like to get to? And Jason, talk us through this from the global study, 3,400 people worldwide.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions. I have been in the backup space for, as I said, 3 decades, and for as long as I've been in the backup space, this has always been one of the questions to ask: is what would drive change, right? Why are you looking at anything other than what you got, right? And so when you look at this, it's a very busy slide. The data on the right is you can choose all the reasons that apply. The short values on the left is which is most important. Right. And it's stack ranked by most important, although I think it's interesting that the top 2 are both most common and most important. And what you see is those top 2, the first one is improving RPO, RTO. So that's exactly the reverse of the reality gap that we just saw, right? 9 out of 10 organizations say they have a protection gap and an availability gap. Sure enough, the primary driver for changing backup solutions in 2022 is to reduce data loss and reduce downtime, right? The number two on that same trend line is improving the reliability of backups, because the reality is you cannot restore what you didn't back up well. So those top two kind of come together as really qualitative improvement. They just want it to work, right? It'd be like asking your neighbor down the street, why are you looking at buying a new car? And they say, well, because my old car breaks down every time I drive it. If someone told you that, you'd say, okay, then why do you still have the old car? Go fix that, right? So qualitative improvement is the first one. The other reason that a lot of your neighbors would probably say I want to change cars is because I can't afford the payments on this one anymore. Right. And economics is actually the second most common driver that we see here. Look in the number 3 slot there, changing from CapEx to OpEx is where we see economics as a consumption model. The fourth slot right behind that, we've already talked a little bit about ROI and TCO. So that's economics from a value model. And if you go to smack center on that list, also you should add in there reducing hardware and software cost. So we see economics as a driver. And in fact, if I run the math for it, so 9 and 9 is 18 plus 7, 25% of organizations, 1 in 4, economics is the primary driver why they're going to change. And if you add the top two together, 11% plus 9%, you get 20%. So 1 in 5 organizations, they just want it to work better. Those are the top two drivers of what's going on at a macro level in data protection. And I, by the way, I will also say I think folks got it right. If it's not going to work better, the fact that I'm saving money is kind of irrelevant. So,
Yep, no, makes complete sense. Now, Jason mentioned that we've got 2 bars here. We ranked these by the most important. That's that kind of yellowish acid green bar on the bottom. And then the teal bars, the calmer green bars are the everything. If you can choose as many as you want, what percentage pick that as an option? For the next slide, we just looked at what was most important. And we did that for federal customers, for state and local customers, and for customers in education. And by the way, education is university all the way down through K through 12. So it's all education sectors. And candidly, the challenges are a lot the same, right? That you've got in those areas. What interested me, Jason, when we took a look at what was most important to those sectors, and those results are just in the table here on the right of the slide, folks, is that once again, there are some commonalities in the answers that we're seeing, right? You can see,
yeah, I
go
love the
ahead.
fact that qualitative improvement comes in within the top 3 on all 3 bands, right? So you can say that RPO, RTO, and reliability. I think of them the same way, right? It's all about reducing data loss, reducing downtime. I love the fact that all 3 are there. Although you can certainly see where economics is really feeling some pressure in education, right? Between K-12 schools that are having to do more with less. Paying for substitutes because full-time teachers. I mean, Jeff, you and I both have educators in our families, and this is something that strikes home with us. So that's not hard to imagine along the way.
Yep, exactly. What interests me as well is when we talk about capabilities, you'll notice another band that goes across all of these is moving backups to the cloud. And Jason, you and I have seen for years, one of the earliest use cases for putting data in the cloud was getting your backups and getting your disaster recovery solution up into the cloud.
Yeah, and if you think about, remember, if the top drivers are around better outcomes and better economics, for a lot of organizations, the cloud is how they're going to do that. It's the how, not just the why. Right. For a lot of organizations, especially when you're going to something like a managed backups or backup as a service or DR as a service, you're not just offloading. You're going to have less hardware on-prem. You're not going to be paying for the licenses the way that you were. You're not just doing that. You're also engaging smarter humans whose only job in life is to monitor your backups and make sure they're working. And so for a lot of folks, those better outcomes and a different consumption model is the how they're going to do that. So I think it makes total sense that public sector organizations are looking at cloud-powered data protection as a primary change driver in 2022.
Absolutely. Now, cost obviously hasn't gone anywhere. It figured in the
Nope.
last slide as well, and it's there. ROI TCO is for all levels, perhaps less important for federal, more important for education, but it's there. And changing the consumption model, going from or to capital expense or operating expense. We deliberately phrased it when we asked this question, whether you want to go to or from. If that's a primary driver, let us know. And it is a primary driver. And it wasn't, by the way, always going from capital expenses to operating expenses. Sometimes it was the reverse. So there's
Yep.
an interesting mix there. So
I would add one other thing, and that is that when we look at large federal institutions, those things, they operate at such a scale is sometimes harder for them to innovate with disruptive platforms because everything they do just has to be at such a grandiose matter. Whereas when you look at some of the state government organizations, as well as a lot of higher ed in particular, they tend to be very pro innovation from a especially cloud hosted type infrastructure. And one of the things that drives is incremental improvement each and every time. And so it doesn't surprise me that things like complementing backups with snapshots and replication is something that you'd see in state and local as incremental innovation around their data protection strategy. It doesn't surprise me, especially in education. A lot of education is pro cloud. And as you modernize from your production being all on prem, where you could use that 5, 7, 10-year-old backup product to do it, as you modernize into Azure hosted, AWS hosted, as you modernize into Office 365, you'll find those legacy backup tools don't work anymore. And so looking for diversifying the backup tool set to cover those new modern workloads is something that a pro cloud dynamic like education, that totally makes sense to me.
Yep, absolutely. We have a good question from Kenneth about the mechanics of recovering software as a service like daily mailbox content. And Kenneth, hold that thought, because we're going to talk more about enterprise backup drivers here in the next couple of slides. So hold that thought, and we will touch on that specific question that you've got about restoring data. Okay, so we've talked about what the issues are, what the infrastructure is. We've talked about what people would like in a general way, but let's get even more specific now, and let's talk about modern data protection. If I say, okay, this is the pain, this is the result that I want, what are the specific things that I think I'd like in a data protection package to give that to me? And Jason, once again, we're going to start with the overall number, 3,400 people worldwide. What do we find out this year?
So when you look at the last slide and this slide, I always think about this as the from and the to. So my family is a scouting family. We do a lot of hiking, we do a lot of camping, and so when you're planning that route, you want to know where you're coming from, where you're going to go to, and then you can figure out the how that happens in between those things. And I know you're a hiker as well, Jeff. So the from, we're looking for better outcomes and better economics. And now when we look at the two, we actually see something a little bit different. In this case, and you're going to see this as a common trend, the top two are about embracing hybrid, both for production and protection. So the top one is about recognizing that for a lot of organizations, DR as a service or leveraging infrastructure on demand, IaaS, is a fantastic way to achieve DR for organizations that couldn't have done it before. And then I love in the number two slot, I love the fact as a high priority item is recognizing that workloads are going to move. They're going to move from physical to virtual. They're going to go from up to a cloud. They're going to come from one cloud to another. Take a look at that middle slot, the ability to move workloads. So certainly we see hybrid and multi cloud being a primary driver for what does modern data protection look like. That's what folks are looking for along that way. And I will soapbox on that middle one for a second. Notice that near the bottom of the list, the ability to actually move a workload from a physical box into a cloud, Amazon's got a utility for that. Azure's got a utility for that. I mean, you can put a workload up, can't get it back, can't move it from one cloud to another, but you can stand it up, right? So that's not what modern looks like. A few years ago it was. But the idea of just recognizing that that most production and protection will be hybrid and multi, and making sure that you have a data protection solution that's comprehensive of that, I think that bodes well to the kinds of innovation that so many organizations are aspiring to.
Yep, yep. And even the lowest priority here, reducing costs and services via alternative consumption models,
Sure.
ties into cloud as well, right? Because disaster recovery or X as a service, backup as a service, ties into cloud. So it's really up and down the stack. We're seeing the same thing. Yep. So
Absolutely.
let's hone in on public sector specifically for exactly the same question. And again, what we did here was color code the same answers in the different columns so that we can get an easy visual comparison. And anything that didn't have a match, we left in black, just like on the last table that we looked at. So, Jason, this is, I think, pretty clear, but talk us through what we see in this table.
Yeah, if you look at the top two rows, I love the fact that that organizations at all scales, in all missions, are all thinking about the same thing, about standardizing the on-prem and their IaaS and their SaaS within the tool set. Now, remember we said earlier about so many organizations are looking at diversifying their tool set. So I'm going to put on my Veeam hat for 10 seconds and just kind of point out that the secret sauce for how you protect Azure is different than Amazon, is different than Google, is different than 365, is different than Salesforce, is different than physical and virtual servers on-prem, right? So the secret sauce may actually vary a little bit. So diversifying the tool set to accommodate a truly rich hybrid multi-environment does not necessarily mean diversifying vendor. And so make sure that you're looking for a vendor that actually is comprehensive about that. But and then ideally you want those multiple tools from the same vendor to talk to each other, right? Because if you do, then you get to accomplish what federal, state, and local, and education all agree on, which is standardizing your policies and your expectations between your on-premise protected workloads and your cloud protected workloads as well. So I love that they're doing that. We talked earlier, state and local, there's a lot of really great innovation happening there. So I love the fact that they're thinking about integration with strategy, with security. They're integrating with DevOps and forensics. So very pro innovation on the state and local side. And that leans nicely into what we're seeing in education. Meanwhile, federal is
Absolutely.
doing everything at scale, right? And it's
Yep.
hard to beat the scale that happens when a PO can open up new dynamic infrastructure on the fly like Draz can do.
Exactly, exactly. Note cost has not gone away. Also
Nope.
note cross-cloud workload mobility, just as Jason said, if you have a tool that lets you standardize your on-prem and cloud policies, very likely, if you're going in the right direction, you've got a tool that will also assist with cross-cloud workload mobility, just like Veeam does, right? The two things kind of go together. If I've got comprehensive data management, it ought to be able to get my data from point A to point B without having to pass an act of Congress to do that. Right.
And you're not even making an exaggeration on that one, are you?
That's right.
The act of Congress. So,
um, what also interested me is if you look at state and local and education explicitly, state and local and education have been hammered by ransomware, two of the hardest hit
yeah.
sectors in the past couple of years. Federal customers don't pay ransoms, and typically the security posture is very advanced, depending on what the mission is, what the organization is. But state and local and education, we all know, we all read the headlines, they've been hit. And there is a very correct consciousness in the top things. And again, remember, this graph isn't all answers. This table is the most important answers for those areas. And state and local and education are very aware that they need a ransomware solution so that they can integrate recovering from ransomware using backups with what they're doing in a holistic way on the whole security side. So
That's
it
right.
makes sense we're seeing that in there too. All right, so we've gone, if you bear with us, from very general, like what's the stuff running on, where are you running your workloads? We've gotten increasingly specific. What would you like to do in data protection in a modern solution? Now, Jason, you've mentioned scale a couple of times, and we also asked explicitly, if you had a solution that you considered an enterprise backup solution, an enterprise in a lot of these cases is really a stand-in word for a really big, a really scalable backup solution. What would you call the features that you'd see in that? And we're going to do the same thing that we've done for the next couple of questions, and we're going to look at the worldwide number for that one. So Jason, talk us through it.
So one thing I'll put just kind of an asterisk on is it was interesting to me the difference between when organizations think about enterprise as sprawl versus scale. So we're gonna talk about that nuance in just a second. But first and foremost, so again, like all the other data points, the lines to the right are choose all that apply. The left lime green, the smaller ones are if you were buying a new enterprise backup solution today, what would be most important for you to do? And it actually tells two different stories. So when you look at most commonly, the top three answers are all workload, right? It used to be that, Jeff, back when neither of us had gray hair, when you said enterprise, it was synonymous with scale, right? Thousands or tens of thousands of devices. And actually, that's on the bottom half of this list. Are enterprises large? Yes. Does an enterprise backup solution mean that everything needs to go into a single monolithic repository? Actually, no. Right now, that said, what enterprise does mean is as long as we've been in this business, enterprise has also mean diverse, right? It's
Mhm.
also meant the worst kind of heterogeneity. You got to back up everything and so it's interesting that we see modern cloud hosted workloads. We see enterprise class applications like Oracle and SAP HANA. We see traditional stuff like NAS, a whole bunch of Unix is still around, right? So certainly, in fact, when you download the report, the URL is actually on the bottom of every slide. I hadn't noticed that before. You're going to see on the page that covers this that enterprise is really a synonym for heterogeneity, right? The diversity of those workloads. That said, when you look at what's most important, take a look at the difference between the most important 21% cloud hosted workloads, IaaS and SaaS, versus the next most important is 13%. It's just over 50% more than the next greatest one. And if you think about it, remember the second question is if you're going to buy a new backup solution today, what's most important for you to look at? And the answer is around IaaS and SaaS because chances are your legacy backup solution works just fine for your legacy production servers. What it doesn't work just fine on is all the modern workloads that we have said for the last couple slides keep coming, right? And so that's going to be what people are solving for when they're looking for new backup is that consistency of protection, including IaaS and SaaS along the way. But just going back to your first point, Jeff, just don't think of it as must be tens of thousands of devices to a single repository. It's not scale, it's sprawl, right? Remote branch offices, tax offices, K-12 schools on site, multi-base in theater, right? All of those scenarios come back to sprawl, not necessarily consolidation at scale. And that's something that's kind of new this year in the data.
Interesting. Interesting. I will do what Jason's been doing here and add up a couple of columns as well so that we can note if you take a look at assuredly reliable, which was most important for 11%, and if you take a look at reputable or well tested among competitive vendors, which is at 9%, which
Yep.
both basically boil down to I want a solution that I'm sure is going to work. I'm going to look at
Trust
what's
it.
out in the market. I want it
Yep.
to be trustworthy. And 20%, if you add those two numbers up, that's critical. So if I'm getting something to protect my data, I want darn well to believe, to know it's going to be a good solution for me, right? So that's a critical value.
That's a great point. I've not actually done that before. So if we put everything into three buckets, you get three buckets. So the top three options, so 21 and 13, so we're at 34 plus 8. So 42%, 2 out of 5 organizations, enterprise is synonymous with heterogeneity. If you take
Mm-hmm.
scale and sprawl, what do we got? 7% plus the 12%, so 19%. So 1 out of 5 is simply about breadth, right, and
Mm-hmm.
reach, a factor of size, and then the last thing is trust, right?
Yep.
Heterogeneous, at scale, that's trusted. Those are our
Yep.
meta trends.
Yep.
I've not done that before, Jeff. Nice job.
Well, there you go. Well, let's jump in and see what public sector said when asked these questions specifically. So cool to see here, Jason. Not really a surprise. And actually, this ties in with what we were just talking about. When you ask what's the most important for our public sector customers, 2 out of 3, number one trait, assuredly reliable, and federal, assuredly reliable is in the top 5, right? So clear requirement. What interested me is that the second requirement was related
Oh
to the
yeah.
fact that if I'm a school, if I'm a state government, if I'm a county even, I have multiple facilities, and certainly for Fed, and I need to be able to manage stuff across multiple locations, including the cloud, obviously, which we also see represented here, right, Jason?
Yep. Absolutely. And I like the fact that assuredly reliable and protecting cloud hosted workloads comes in the top five in all three of the public sector segments. And again, I would just go back to when you look at what's happened in the overall industry over the last couple of years, a lot of organizations in 2021, as we really normalized around remote workforces, around higher dependencies on data, responding to the pandemic, for all of those kind of things, especially when you're looking at serving the citizenry, it would be logical that many organizations really accelerated their modernization of production. And most organizations didn't have the ability to modernize their protection at the same rate. And so what we see in both public and private is last year was the year where everything got as cloudy as they could to modernize production. And this year they're realizing that many of those workloads are underprotected. This is the year they're going to double down on fixing reliability, supporting those production workloads to kind of catch up and let the other shoe drop, if you will.
You know, that is a perfect intro, Kenneth. I promised you that we would get back to your question about email restores a couple of minutes ago. Jason just talked about modernizing where you're putting your data. And one super common place where data has been going up to the cloud from on-prem for years now has been Microsoft 365. I'm getting rid of my NAS. I'm going to OneDrive. I'm getting rid of managing my own Exchange servers. I'm going to Exchange Online. Same thing with Teams. Same thing with SharePoint Online. Kenneth's question is, how do you handle recovery of mailbox content in the case, and this is a private sector question, you have a stockholder lawsuit where they request email communication for a 12-month period. But Kenneth, I can tell you, I had exactly the same conversation with 3 city CIOs at our Veeam On conference last year. All 3 of them were delighted Microsoft 365 customers. All 3 of them used Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 because they're a city CIO, and cities get sued for various reasons. And they knew that they were answerable to e-discovery requests. And all of them were also answerable to state Freedom of Information Act requests. My Sarasota, Florida CIO, it's the Sunshine Law in Florida, right? Keep all public records so you can respond to Freedom of Information Act requests. To your point, Kenneth, Microsoft 365 is resilient. We co-present with Microsoft. We're huge partners with them. It's a mutual admiration society, but a recycle bin does not give you the ability to go back and restore 12 months of email for these 5 people from 8 years ago, right? That's not what you get. It's not what it's designed to do. Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365, or to the broader point that Jason just made, enterprise backup, modern backup applications do give you the ability to be responsive to the whole spectrum of things that you might need to do. Right.
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you hadn't mentioned it, I would have. There is almost no difference between a shareholder litigation and a FOIA request. In both cases, you're having to go backward in an unplanned way. And like Jeff, I'm a big Microsoft fan. I'm also a Microsoft alum. But I will tell you, the recycle bin is not enough, right? And in fact, there's a whole nother project that we did just looking at the protection of IaaS and SaaS. It's a different research project. The URL for that is VEE.am/CPT 21 report. It's the Cloud Protection Trends 2021 report, CPT 21 report. And what you'll see in that is, even when we look at the differences between SaaS admins on 365 versus backup admins, they actually get it right. They understand that things like litigation hold is not enough. That a legal freeze is not enough, right? And by the way, once you freeze like that, it consumes storage from that point on, and you don't get to go and select a folder. You don't get to go and search for things related to this keyword. That is not part of that function, right? And by the way, are you really going to do legal hold on every person in the organization waiting for a litigation event that may or may not happen? So you still need backup for all of those reasons.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to answer a couple of questions real quickly, and then we're going to dig in more. And by the way, folks, Jason and I Jason devotes a lot of his professional life to gathering this research. So I'm really jazzed that we're getting so many good questions about what you're hearing here, because this is, I know Jason introed it early on, this is actually the biggest research project that anyone, including any analyst firm, does about what we're seeing in this space. So a quick question. Nikhil asks, so based on the data, burst capacity in the cloud or disaster recovery in the cloud is a well-established strategy by others in public sector? The short answer is yes, and it has been for years, right? That is absolutely the case. The percentage is growing, but the answer is yes. Another question, and we actually have had two of these. This question relates to current events based on the current Ukrainian-Russian conflict. How much has that foregrounded the need for cybersecurity and for the ability to recover from malware attacks, especially if you're a high visibility organization, or if you're in, one of the questions asked specifically about schools and government, which we said before, those have been really hit. Yes, it does, right? The National Security Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a number of public bodies have warned loudly in the past week and a half that you need to take a good look right now at your ransomware resiliency, at your general malware resiliency, because we're currently in a world environment where there might be an increased cyber threat landscape where things are about to get scarier. That also applies, we were just talking about Microsoft 365. Veeam has customers who have had their SharePoint Online and OneDrive environments affected by ransomware. And so it really, really helps to have backups of that for a lot of reasons, but also for ransomware resiliency. All right.
Can I pile on that one really quick?
Yep.
Because one of the things that and I hate that there are bad humans out there that take advantage of this, but what we're seeing for many of the organizations, including Russia and Ukraine, but almost any time that there's a significant, I'm going to call it a disaster, at scale at a regional level. So you'd see the same thing in Florida as it gets close to hurricane season. You see the same thing habitually in the Northeast when you see those first power outages and snowstorms come in. Whenever there's a regional crisis, there's because elastic infrastructure in the cloud can be such a great lifeboat. It's a great way to jump in and say, I can solve this, right? I'm going to stand this up. The problem is that when you migrate things in a reactive way, you don't typically have the time or the bandwidth to do all the things that you really ought to do to lock it down while you go. And so what happens is, and the abrupt migrations that are happening for infrastructure in Eastern Europe right now is a good example of this. It opens up the attack surface, right? Hey, I'm going to move these servers over, and then I will lock down the firewalls and stuff tomorrow. And in between today's migration and tomorrow's lockdown, bad actors are rabidly looking for that increased attack exposure. And so while I applaud the use of elastic infrastructure as part of that mitigation and that migration, just make sure that you're handling the lockdown of that as that data is going up so that you're not actually exposing an additional attack surface while you do it.
Great question. Okay, there's one more set of slides and comparisons we want to do, but I'm going to answer two questions super quickly that have come in. Gilbert, do public sector IT organizations tend to be leaner or fatter than private sector IT orgs? The answer in my experience, and I bet Jason's is the same, as it depends. If we're talking about financial services, they tend to have a lot of folks, and they tend to, because they're highly regulated, to have a lot of capabilities. The same is true of other highly regulated sectors. They tend to have a lot of people because they have a lot of hoops that they have to jump through. In general, in my experience, public sector orgs tend to run a bit leaner, especially at the state and local level and in education for sure. And that's for budget reasons, right? They have to do more with less. All right. I want to look real quickly at causes of outages, because this relates to a lot of what we've been talking about with data protection. And Jason, once again, we're going to follow the exact same model. Talk us through the global report.
Yeah, from a global perspective, now in this case, we got 3 color bands on each. So as always, to the right, this is most common outages over the last 2 years running. And what you see on that far right-hand edge is stuff still breaks. Right? In 2022 or 21 and 20, stuff is still breaking. Infrastructure still breaks. Applications still crash. OS is still patched badly, right? Hardware drives still crash, right? Stuff still breaks. But if you look at the top, it's actually sorted by what's been the most impactful outage, and those short lines are the most impactful outages for 2021 and the most impactful outage for 2020. Spoiler alert: for the last 2 years in a row, the most impactful outage has been a cybersecurity event, and that is just downright scary. It is more pervasive. It is more aggressive. Remediation is harder. Most impactful outage. But I would go ahead and actually tell you that if you actually can lump the top two most impactful outages together, because they're both human, right? I mean, we can blame stuff breaks, right? But you've got bad actors in the number one slot, and then you have less trained, well-intentioned users that they overwrite last month's data with this month's data. They delete their own folder, and they're actually deleting a team folder, right? Humans do silly stuff, or they do evil stuff, not in that order. But the most impactful outages are human caused. Most common is stuff still breaks, even in 22.
Exactly. And by the way, the top two items are great arguments for backup, because
Amen.
resiliency in my configuration doesn't help in the case of a human making a mistake that abrogates the resiliency in my configuration, right? And it's a reason to have a backup.
And I would also point out on that same thing that the cloud is not a silver bullet that solves all the breakage things on the right. Infrastructure and networking is harder to configure correctly when you're going to a cloud. Applications still crash in a cloud. Hard drives on a cloud hosted server still crash, right? So the cloud is not a silver bullet. And yes, humans are still a problem.
So let's look at this. And this is the last data point that we're going to be able to talk through today. When we looked at the causes, if we lump together exactly as we just did, sort of human error, human factors here, you'll notice that in the case of federal cybersecurity event, a bad actor attacking, or state and local government, accidental data is there. And then in education, administrator configure error or a cybersecurity event is there. We have a pretty significant percentage of the most common outages. Now, I will make a point. This is most common we're looking at here, not most important, because we got to pick one. So we weren't going to just say most important 2021, most important 2022. This is the most common in this year's survey. But you'll notice people are involved. And then obviously, exactly, Jason, to your point, infrastructure, things still break, right? Wherever it's running.
Yeah. And again, when you look at federal, it doesn't surprise me that you'd see cyber and infrastructure, because scale by definition means a broader attack surface, right? So that does not surprise me. We talked earlier about, because especially local IT and education tend to have leaner IT teams, not only in number, but they tend not to hire as many depth experts as the private sector, right? Private sector can typically pay more. And so those depth experts over time, you lose those skills unless you really have a good partner that can complement those skills with those depth areas. And so because of that, you'll see more hardware centric issues. You'll see more admin centric issues, just because that skill set doesn't always get to pervade across some of the smaller organizations.
Perfect. Folks, thank you so much for your time. I think that is all that Jason and I have time to go through in today's webinar. I will point out, if you'd like more on all things Veeam, we have our big annual user conference coming up in just a couple of months in May, and that is going to be both in person and virtual. The URL to register is right here, so you can do that. And I'm going to hand things back over to Scott now. If you'd like the URL for the public sector specific report we've been talking about, that's there. And Scott, I'll hand it over to you for our drawing.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jason and Jeff. That was a fantastic discussion and great research. Really appreciate you guys coming on today.
Thanks.
And before we wrap up, we do have that last piece of business. It's the $300 Amazon gift card prize drawing, and the winner is Craig Sensen from New Jersey. So congratulations to Craig. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Veeam for making this event possible. And thanks as always for attending and for your great questions. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.